Welcome to our class on Chassidus. This week we're going to be learning a beautiful Chassidic discourse. The name of the Chassidic discourse is called Kisisa. The Rebbe said this Chassidic discourse on Shabbos Parshas Kisisa in the year Tavshin Chav Ches, which is exactly 53 years ago. So the Chassidic discourse is based on the verse of the opening of the Parsha, Kisisa Srois B'nai Yisrael. And the Rebbe says that in this week's Torah portion, Parshas Kisisa, it speaks about the avodah, the service in the Mishkan, the service in the tabernacle. And the Rebbe says, we all know, it says in the Talmud and Tractate Eruvin, that the Migdash, the Beit HaMikdash, is also called the Mishkan. And so we're talking about the service of the Mishkan and the Migdash as well, because they're both connected. Which specific service in the Mishkan and the Mishkan and the Mikdash as well? It's the service of the Maaseh HaKtoros, the service of the incense. In other words, we know in the temple there was we brought sacrifices, that's the Kabbalah, but also there was the offering of the incense, Ktoros. And the Ktoros is one of the main spiritual services that took place in the Mishkan. So the Rebbe says, even though he's making a statement that this week's Torah portion is the main, it talks about in depth about the Ktoros, the Rebbe says, even though seemingly in the previous Torah portion, Parshas Tetzaveh, also speaks about Ktoros, and the same thing also in the next Torah portion, Parshas Vayakel, also speaks about Ktoros, but the Rebbe says, in the previous Torah portion, the next Torah portion, it speaks about the Ktoros, the incense, in a general terminology. But over here in this week's Torah portion, it speaks about it with tremendous depth and tremendous detail. In other words, what's the depth and what's the detail of the Ktoros? So first of all, the preparations for the Ktoros, how you prepare the Ktoros. Also, what the Ktoros, the incense, was made of. And also the tremendous importance of the Ktoros. Also, it speaks about the prohibition, God forbid, if it's not done in the right manner, and the importance and the strictness and to adhere to the details of the Ktoros, up until what the Torah actually says in this week's Torah portion, if you do not do the Ktoros the way you're supposed to, or if you do it when you shouldn't be doing it, unfortunately the punishment is the opposite of life. And this punishment of opposite of life speaks specifically in this week's Torah portion, because it's speaking about the importance of the Ktoros, how important it is to make sure it's done right and to done in the right setting, etc. Now, even though you're going to say sacrifices also have tremendous prohibitions. You're not allowed to slaughter sacrifices outside the temple, or you're not allowed to bring in foreign sacrifices into the temple. There's all laws with reference to sacrifices as well. But the Rebbe says, nevertheless, it does not compare to Ktoros. Because in Ktoros, it's literally the punishment of the opposite of life. If somebody, for example, copies the formula for the Ktoros, it's a serious offense. So you see that Ktoros is a very, very serious issue. Both on the negative, God forbid if you do it wrong, and obviously on the positive as well. So the Rebbe is now going to explain the idea of what? Of the Ktoros. The Rebbe says that generally speaking, the Kabbalah, the sacrifices, and the service of the Ktoros, that is basically the spiritual service in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. And he quotes from the previous Rebbe who spoke about it in the famous Chassidic Discourse of Basi Lagani, which we learned in honor of Yud Shvat. And over there he says that the main service in the Mishkan was, and in the Mishkan and the Migdash, is the service of the Karbanot, the sacrifices, and the sacrifices over there include the Ktoros as well. And therefore he explains that, the previous Rebbe explains in the Chassidic Discourse of Basi Lagani, that's why the Mishkan was made of specifically Atzei Shittim, cedar wood, and as he explains at the whole length in the Chassidic Discourse that we learned in reference to Yud Shvat, to transform the silliness of our life and so on and so forth. But through the work of what? Making the Mishkan and bringing the sacrifices and the Ketores, we accomplish the biblical commandment where Hashem says, "V'shachanti b'soicham," that when you make to me the Mikdash, when you make to me the Mishkan, when you make the tabernacle and the holy place for Hashem, and you do the spiritual service of what? Of the sacrifices and the incense, Hashem will dwell amongst the Jewish people. Now, generally speaking, what's the spiritual significance of these sacrifices? So, karbonot is the Hebrew term for a sacrifice. Carbon has the same letters as karoiv, close. In other words, the purpose of the sacrifice is that we should become, every part of us, all our koiches, all our attributes, our intellectual, our emotional, should become close to Hashem. Up until we should become so close, where it says in the Zohar, Raza the Kurbana, that the secret, of the ingredients of their sacrifices, that it brings us close till Raza the Ein Sof, till we get to the closeness of the infinite light of Hashem. So you see, the idea of the Karbanot is to bring us close to the infinite light of Hashem. But the Rebbe says that's in general about the service in the temple and about the sacrifices. However, there's a major difference between the sacrifices, regular sacrifices, and specifically what we're going to talk about this week, the incense that was brought into the temple. What's the difference? So the Rebbe says we find that when it comes to sacrifices, sacrifice is called achila. It's like food. And the Rebbe quotes the verse in the Torah. It says, "Es karbani lachmi liishai," my sacrifice, which is lechem, like bread. You bring it up as an offering, but the point is, you see clearly the Torah refers to sacrifice, the avodah, the spiritual service of food. You're feeding the relationship with Hashem. And based on this, the Rebbe says that's where we see that the Bnei Yisrael are called Rayasi. We become like a friend, a loving friend with Hashem. What does it mean, Rayasi? So we know that if you're in a relationship, you have to feed the relationship. Rayasi, Parnasasi, you have to feed it. How do we feed the relationship with Hashem? So every single day we put 2 sacrifices, at least 2. The one in the morning, one in the evening, Shnei Tzmidim, 2 every day. And like it says in the Medrash that the Bnei Yisrael feed their Father in heaven by what? By bringing a sacrifice. So again, to be clear, a sacrifice is on the realm of food. Feeding the altar, feeding Hashem, feeding the relationship. It's the spiritual idea of lechem, of food. On the other hand, what is the spiritual significance of Ketores, incense? The spiritual significance of Ketores is reach. Reach is a fragrance, smell, something that you take in not through your mouth as food, but something you take in through your nose, through your nostrils. Now, the Rebbe says, just to be clear, even though generally speaking in Kedushas everything is intertwined. So even though, for example, what we just say, that a sacrifice is food, and Ketores is more reach, so even though that's in general, but obviously in Karbonos there is an aspect of reach as well. It's not the strong suit of a carbon. The strong suit of a carbon is the food. But it also has an aspect of reach. As we know, the Torah says clearly, reach nichoyach laHashem. When it refers to a sacrifice, it also calls it a reach, a fragrance. However, but to be clear, when it comes to a sacrifice, it does have a component of reach. But what's the main avodah of a carbon? It's achila, it's food. And as the Rebbe gives an example, like it's brought down, the Alter brings in one of the famous Discourses, he says that when they differentiate between the reach that goes in, for example, to the right nostril versus the left nostril in reference to Ketores. In reference to Ketores, it says it depends if it goes in from the right or from the left. And so it doesn't say anything about going into the right nostril, the left nostril, where it's a deeper connection about the sacrifices. That's only in reference to what the Ketores, about the incense. Why? Because, again, even though there is a reach nichoyach when it comes to karbonis, that's not its main thing. The main thing is achila. But shenkin Ketores, since the main thing is reach, the fragrance, the fact that it goes through the nostril, the right and the left, which one is deeper, which one is stronger, which one is more intense. It's a long idea that spoke about in Kabbalah. There isn't going to in tremendous in depth here. But the point there is bringing is that this whole idea of going in right and left only applies to what? To Ketores. Why? Because Ketores is the main theme is reach. And therefore, since the main thing is reach, So we find something else powerful and unique about Ketores. That Ketores is specifically made for, because it's so powerful, to transform L'umas Zeh, the opposite of Kedusha, the opposite of holiness. In other words, how do we see that Ketores is there to transform the opposite of holiness? So the Rebbe says very simple, because we know that if you want to bring a sacrifice, you can't bring a non-kosher animal. It has to be a kosher animal. Only things that you can eat. Why? Because a korban, a sacrifice, can only transform holiness, something which is already kosher, something which has certain components. That's a kosher animal. If it's not kosher, you can't elevate it by a sacrifice. However, when it comes to Ketores, so we know, for example, in the Ketores, as the Torah tells us, there's something. One of the ingredients is called moir. Moir is literally from L'umas. It's not a kosher spice. It's not a kosher fragrance. And like the Alter Rebbe brings, Eric brings from the Alter Rebbe brings, when it says in the Megillah that when they prepared the woman to go to Achashverosh, so it says Shisha Chadashim. They were for 6 months, and what were the things that they gave them? So one of the things was Shemen Hamor. So you see over there, you have the idea of Mor in the preparing the woman when they went to Achashverosh. And then, for example, it also says Mordechai is also in the Targum. It says Miradachia. It's also a certain type of spice on a spiritual level. In other words, so not only is Mor from L'umas the opposite of holiness, but the Rebbe says even further, every one of the 11 spices that were used in the Ketores has some kind of connection with the opposite of holiness. Again, because Ketores has the power to elevate the L'umas, the other side of holiness. And as we see clearly that specifically in the Ketores, how many ingredients were there? There was 11. And matter of fact, if there was 10 or 9, it's not kosher. It has to be specifically 11. It was part of the ingredients of Ketores, besides each one that it was, but it had to be a component of 11. Now, what does that mean practically? So it means even though every one of the spices of the incense had its own component, but nevertheless, if you brought 1 or 2 or 5, even 10, it would be disqualified. They each had to be part of the 11. Why? Because 11 in the spiritual world is also l'umazeh. It's also opposite of holiness. It's not Kedusha, it's not holiness. Why? Because in Kedusha we know what's the magic number for holiness is Eser, is 10. 10 means 10, not 9, not 11. Holiness is all about 10. On the other hand, 11 is the opposite of holiness. And as the Rebbe brings, that we know, for example, when it refers to in the Torah, the Alufei Esav, the officers of Esav. So how many were there? There was 11 Alufei Esav. So the 11 Ketores is connected to the Alufei Esav, which is the opposite of holiness. That means every one of the 11 Ketores was connected to one of the 11 Alufei Esav. In other words, so you see clearly that every one of the Ketores, besides the fact that it's part of the 11, but every single one is connected to, unfortunately, to L'umazeh. But so if that's the case, why are we bringing 11? Why are we bringing Moir? Why are we bringing things that are connected to the opposite of holiness? Because our job is to transform the opposite of holiness. Our job is to transform the L'umazeh. Our job is to transform the opposite of holiness to make it holy. So how do we do that? We do that because we bring the Ketores. And the Ketores, as we said before, what's the Ketores? The essence of Ketores? It's all about Reyach. It's all about the fragrance, the odor, the smell, which actually reaches much higher than sacrifices. So again, to recap what the Rebbe is saying over here, this week's Torah portion we're learning about what Ketores. And Ketores is much more powerful than Kabbalah. Kabbalah is only achila, something which is eaten. Ketores, on the other hand, is reach, it's a fragrance. And it has the power to transform the l'umas are the opposite of holiness, the opposite of 11, the opposite of everything out there in the world. Why? Because Ketores is connected to reich, and reich has the power and the ability to transform and to elevate. Now the question is, where does Ketores have this power to elevate? And the Rebbe explains, because what's Ketores, we said, it's reich. What's the quality and what's the power of Reach? That Reach reaches Etzem HaNefesh, the essence of our soul. And because Reach reaches the Etzem HaNefesh, and when you get to the Etzem, the essence of your soul, it's very powerful there. And you can elevate something which is even obviously opposite than Kedusha, opposite in holiness. So therefore, since Reach is connected to Etzem HaNefesh, so Reach has the power. And specifically, it has a very, very strong power of fragrance. What does it have the power to do? We see physically on a physical level that a reach, a strong reach, can wake somebody up. They even have the special smells they give you if someone's fainting. It can wake someone up if they're fainting, if someone's sleeping. You put the right odor by their nose, boom, they're going to wake up. Why? Because reich is very powerful. It can wake you up. And that is only specifically from reich, from the smell. It doesn't work with eating. And on the contrary, the Rebbe says that eating causes you to sleep. How do we know that eating causes you to sleep? So firstly, you can try it. You'll see, you eat a lot, you're going to get tired. First, you're going to smell certain fragrances. You're going to be excited. You're going to be ready to dance and to jump and to work and to do what you have to. Reich is very powerful. But the Rebbe says, he brings, for example, an example where it says in Tractate Yuma, the tractate speaks about Yom Kippur. What does it say in Tractate Yuma? That the Kohen Gadol would have to refrain from eating on Erev Yom Kippur, because since he's going to have to work very hard on Yom Kippur, it's the hardest day of the year for the Kohen Gadol, like to work, and then they have to pray on behalf of all the Jewish people. It was an intense service, so you don't want him falling asleep in Yom Kippur. So in Yom Kippur, nobody eats. But even on Erev Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol doesn't eat. Why? Why doesn't he eat? Maybe he should eat, he should have strength. No, because eating will make him tired. So if he's going to eat less, he won't be as tired and he'll have to do his avodah. So that's, we see that eating is not good for you because it causes you to go to sleep. On the contrary, reach, the more of a reich you have, the more of a good aroma, it actually wakens you up from sleeping. Why? Because reich reaches the essence of your soul. And when it reaches the essence of your soul, you wake up. And therefore, so because Reach wakes you up, that's why the Kohen Gadol not only didn't he eat every Yom Kippur, but what was the avodah on Yom Kippur? What was the avodah of the Kohen Gadol in Yom Kippur? The day of the year, it was with Tyrus, incense. He brought an incense into the temple. Why? Because it's to wake up spiritually. In other words, just like in this physical world, when you smell the proper fragrance, it wakens up the essence of your soul. So the same thing also in the Beis Hamikdash. That what was the avodah of the Kohen Gadol in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, with the Reach, with the Ketores, to wake up the Jewish people. Now the Rebbe says, 1 second. You're going to say he woke up, why? Because he brought in the Ketores. But the fact is, he also would bring in the blood from the sacrifices also. But the Rebbe says the fact is, yes, it's true. But what's the main avodah? What's the main service in Yom Kippur in the Kodesh HaKadoshim? Was specifically the Ketores, was specifically the incense. And not only that, the novel idea of the Ketores on Yom Kippur in the temple was when he would bring it into Holy of Holies. And because it was so powerful, and it had the components and the ingredients to wake everyone up, so therefore there was no one in the temple when the Kohen Gadol did his service. And that was when in Yom Kippur, Kodesh Kadoshim. But the Rebbe says this was also a whole year. In Chassidus, they explain the avodah of the Kohen Gadol in Yom Kippur. But the fact is, the whole year when they would bring the sacrifice, the incense, it was because the power of the Ketores. Now, why is that? Because Reach, the odor and the fragrance reaches the essence of a soul. And just like it's physically, that the Reach, the proper fragrance, has the power to wake someone up, so the same thing also spiritually. The bright fragrance will wake you up spiritually. It'll wake you up from our sleep. How? Through smelling it, because it reaches the essence of our soul. And the Rebbe explains, what does it mean, the idea of sleeping? What does that mean, it means sleeping? So the Rebbe brings from a Chassidic Discourse of Purim, where it says in Shir HaShirim, from King Solomon, so it says like this, Ani yashena. Hashem says, Ani yashena, I am sleeping. The libi air, but my heart is awake. Koil doidi doifek. The voice of my lover is banging. And the Rebbe explains, what does it mean spiritually? In other words, in Gullus, in exile that we're living in, unfortunately, the Jewish people are sleeping. We're asleep. The fact is, God is not revealed. When God is not revealed, we fall asleep. We go to sleep. So what happens when we're sleeping? So what does the verse say? Ani yashena, I'm sleeping, but v'libi air, my heart is awake. What does it mean my heart is awake? So the Rebbe explains spiritually, what does that mean? That my heart is awake means that the yechida shabanefesh, and as we know in the soul, there's 5 levels. Nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, yechida. Nefesh being the most external part of the soul. Ruach already gets more internal. Neshama, chaya, yechida is the most internal part. So even though sometimes the nefesh can be sleeping, the ruach can be sleeping, but the yechida, the essence of everyone's soul, is always awake. It's always alive by every single person. So even though I'm sleeping, again, ani yashena, we're sleeping, but the libi air, the yechida of every single neshama is alive. So kol doidi, the sound of my lover, doifek, is banging, and he's saying, why is he banging? So that achoisi, rayosi, ainasi, tamasi, we should be alive with love and complete love for Hashem. Now the Rebbe says in that Chassidic discourse, he explains the whole idea of ani yashena, we're sleeping, and where it says afterwards, pashati katanti, I already took off my clothes, which over there he's speaking about after the kol doidi doifik, after the lover is knocking. But the Rebbe continues on to explain. He says like this. So after the kol doidi doifik, he's trying to wake us up. So the Rebbe says, Oyne Knesset Yisrael. So we answer to Hashem. You're trying to wake us up, right? You're waking up the neshama. Pashati es kaitanti. I took off my garments already. Eichal b'shana. How can I go ahead and put it back on again? I'm already sleeping. So the Rebbe brings from the Rebbe Maharash and from the Tzemach Tzedek, and in their commentaries on Shir Hashirim on this verse, Doidi Shalach Yodai, that my lover sends out his hand. So he brings like this. He brings that from, it says in Medrash of Shir Hashirim on the verse, Pashati is Katanti, that he already took off my clothes. So it says, what kind of clothes did he take off? What is it referring to? So the Tzemach Tzedek and their Marash bring from the Medrash that says, what clothes did we take off? So he says it's referring to the clothes of the Bigdei Kahuna, the garments of the Kohen, the garments of Bigdei Malchus, the garments of the kingdom. Well, what does that mean practically? That means in Gullus, we're in Gullus. When we're in Gullus, guess what? Unfortunately, the garments of the priest aren't there. We don't have the Avodah in the Beis Mikdash. We don't have the garments of Bigdei Malchus. We don't have the Jewish kingdom, the kingdom of King David. It's not alive and well. We're in Gullus. So Pashatis Katanti, the clothes of Kahuna and Malchus are off. So the Rebbe asks, what's the connection between the garments of the Kohen and over here? We're now in Gullus. What does that have to do? The garments of the Kohen are off. And he explains, because since I am sleeping, in Gullus we're sleeping, and the lover is banging on the door, was trying to wake us up. So we answer that what? We took off the garments. We don't have the garments of the priest. What does that mean practically? We don't have the sacrifices. We don't have the sacrifices, and the reference to the sacrifices says, it's a reach nichoyach la Hashem, it's a pleasing fragrance to Hashem. And specifically, not only we don't have the sacrifice, we don't have the ktoiris today. We don't have the incense, which that is reach. And we know reach wakes up from our sleep. So what we're saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we're sleeping. Okay, so what are you saying? The neshama is alive. But guess what? The garments we don't have. We don't have the karbonos. We don't have the ktoiris. We don't have the ability to wake us up. We don't have the reach. We don't have the fragrance. And since I already took off the garments, which means the garments of the priesthood we don't have. We don't have the fragrance from the sacrifices, and more specifically, we don't have the fragrance from the ktoiris, from the incense. So therefore, he explains the Shir Hashirim. Eicha el b'shana, how am I going to put on the garments? How am I going to wake up in the level of a choisi rayasi, of being a lover and a sister and a bride to the Hashem? So the Ruach HaKodesh answers, Hashem answers, and he says, Rachatzti esragli eicha at nafim. As I already washed my feet, how am I going to go ahead and get them dirty? So the Rebbe explains, because in reference to the Beis HaMikdash it says, Hashemayim kisi, the heaven is the place of my throne, the ha'aretz hadoim ragli. In other words, the feet of Hashem are where down in this world. Where's Hashem's feet? In the Beis HaMikdash. How is Hashem's feet in the Beis HaMikdash when the Shekhinah is in the Beis HaMikdash? And as he quotes the verse where it says, "Hashemayim, Hashemayim loikalchucha," the heaven cannot attain the full presence of Hashem. Av ki habayis is only specifically in the house, the Beis HaMikdash. So that's the question. Where can I put my feet? The Beis HaMikdash is not here. Since Chatzti Esragli, I already washed my feet. And the Rebbe says in Yiddish, I already washed myself off from being enclosed into the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore, how am I going to go ahead and get connected again? So in other words, the Rebbe brings from this medrash and from the Rebbe Marash and the Tzemach Tzedek, you see clearly that unfortunately, the time of Galus, what we need is the Ketores to wake us up. We don't have the Ketores to wake us up. So if we don't have the Ketores to wake us up, how are we going to connect it to Hashem? So the Rebbe says, 1 second. What are you saying? We don't have the Kabbalas, which we don't. We don't have the Ketores, so how are we going to wake up? But the Rebbe says, 1 second. We all know in the time of Galus, what we do instead of the sacrifices, what we do instead of the incense, we have prayers. And we know that the prayers are in place of the sacrifices. And the Rebbe says, okay, fine. That's in terms of the kabbanis. But where do we have this? Where do we have the incense today? And the Rebbe says we have the Ketores also today. What's the Ketores today? And this is important to know. The Ketores is kabbanis, as we say the general prayers. What is the Ketores? The Ketores is the prayer, the Mincha service. The Mincha prayer service is the Ketores. Matter of fact, before Mincha we recite the Ketores, but the whole Mincha service is the Ketores. And it's called actually Mincha's Ketores. So the Mincha is the Ketores. So l'chayr, we do have an ability to wake up by bringing the karbonos, by bringing the Ketores, which is through the general, so gesund, by bringing the general sacrifices and by bringing the Ketores. And like the Rebbe says, we all know what's brought down in many places in Chassidus about the power of the afternoon prayer service, the power of the Mincha service over all the other prayers. And as we know, for example, it says clearly in the Talmud that Eliyahu, when he prayed to Hashem, when was he answered specifically? When? In the prayer of Mincha. Because Mincha is on the level of Ketores. And like, for example, it says in the Haftorah of Parashas Kisisa, the way Eliyahu was answered through the prayer specifically of Mincha. So the Rebbe explains, so what's the issue? We have it today. We have the prayers. We have Mincha, which is the Ketores. The Rebbe says no. Because the fact is when we draw down light and energy through the prayers, whether it's the general prayers and the Ketores of Mincha, so we know that when you pray, you bring down chayas, energy, vitality, only into pnimius ha'olamis, the internal part of the worlds. But the problem is we need to have not only the energies come down into the internal worlds, but it has to come down in chitzonius ha'olamis, in the external part of the world. In other words, like for example, it says when you learn Torah, you have to say it bepeh, you have to say it with your mouth, because if you just think it, you're only bringing down energy into the internal part. When you say it, you're bringing down the energy into the physical world. And like the Alter Rebbe speaks about in tremendous length, we learned in Tanya already, that it's important to say the words when you're learning, when you're davening, because if you just think it, you're just going to draw down energy into the internal worlds. You want to bring down the energy into the external worlds as well. And that's why, for example, it's very, very important. Besides the fact that we have to learn and we have to pray, you have to do physical mitzvahs. Why? Because a mitzvah is action. And action brings down energy into the physical external worlds. And as we know, for example, the whole purpose of learning Torah and doing mitzvahs, specifically in this world, is so that we can do mitzvahs in this world. Like with the famous argument between the angels. Why are you giving the Torah to the Jewish people? So what does Hashem say? Did you go down to Egypt? We're in this world. We're in Galus. However, so even though when you bring a physical sacrifice, so the sacrifice, you actually draw down into the physical world through the physical sacrifice. So that's in the times of the temple, when you brought a physical sacrifice. So in the times of the temple, when you brought a physical sacrifice, so you draw down the light into the internal world and the external world because it was a physical sacrifice. But today, when we're praying, and it's not a physical sacrifice, and it's in place of the sacrifice, that's correct. So we're only drawing down where? Into the internal worlds. How are you drawing down the energy into the external worlds? On the other hand, mitzvahs, we draw down energy into the external worlds. So, but because when we're praying, which is in place of the sacrifices, and we bring the Mincha service, which is in place of the incense, it only draws down into the internal world. So even it's important. It's great. So therefore, the Bnei Yisrael tell the Hashem, Pashati is katanti. You took off my garment. We don't have the avodah of the kohanim in the temple. So how are we going to bring it down to this external world? How are we going to bring down? How are you going to wake us up? So the verse continues in Shir Hashirim, and King Solomon says, Doidi shalach yodoi min hachor. That my uncle, my beloved, sent his hand out from the chor, from the latch, which means that the Ruach HaKodesh answers to Hashem, that says, Rachatzti ragli echad, I washed my feet, how am I going to go ahead and engage again? But he says, no, doidi shalach. What is doidi shalach? What does that mean, doidi shalach yadi? What does it mean, my beloved sent his hand? So what that means on a spiritual level is, doidi is referring to the ava atzmitz, the internal love that Hashem has for the Jewish people. So even though we don't have the through kabbanos and through the incense, we only bring it down to the eternal world, but through doidi shalach, the internal love that Hashem has for the Jewish people, and like the Rebbe says, the Alter Rebbe explains this on a different Chassidic discourse, and the Rebbe Rashab as well explains it. But because you have the ava atzmis, the essential love, Hine shalach yodei min achor, he's able to bring down his hand. And what is chur? So Rebbe explains. So we know in Megillah it says chur karpas es cheles, but chur also comes from the word of cherus, freedom. And when you have the real essential love, then you have pischali, then Hashem totally is opened up to you. And what does that mean, pischali? So the Rebbe explains very simple. It's not just pischali opened up, but pischali, it's opened up on the 4 levels of achoisi is one level, like a sister, rayasi, a friend, yainasi, tamasi, a dove, a complete dove, on all 4 levels. What does these 4 levels mean? Achoisi, rayasi, yainasi, tamasi. What does it mean practically? So we said, what did the Rebbe just explain? That Doidi Shalach, what is he sending? It's connecting to the Ava Atzmitz, the essential love, on 4 levels. Achaisi, Yainasi, Rayasi, Tayamasi. So the Rebbe said it's 4 different levels of the Avodah of love. 4 different levels of love. Why? Because there's no, and I'll say it in Aramaic and I'll translate, the less polchana k'prochana derech misa. There's no power as the power of rachmim, of love, of passion. And there's 4 levels of love. And then you have the avodah also of doing the mitzvahs, doing the mitzvahs. And the Rebbe says that these 4 levels of doing the mitzvahs and these 4 levels of love is connected to the 4 letters of the Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei. Every one of these is connected to one of the letters. And when Hashem shares with us and we share with Him the essential love that we're totally connected, so then what happens is we have, like it says in the Megillah, La Yehudim Hoisa Oira, we have light. V'simcha, we have joy, we have happiness, sasain, v'ikar. And the Rebbe says it's possible to say that these 4 levels of Oira, light, Simcha, joy, Sasain, happiness, V'yikar, and beauty, it's possible these four levels is connected to the four letters of the Shem Havaya, Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei. And Rebbe explains it beautifully. What's the connection between the 4 letters and the four letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei and Oira, V'Simcha, V'Sasain, V'yikar? Rebbe says like this: Oira, we know, is Torah. What's real light? Real light is learning Torah. Why? Because it says in the verse clearly, Ki ner mitzvah, the candle is like a mitzvah, but Torah, that when you learn Torah, that's the real light. Every time you learn Torah, you connect to the light of Hashem. And we all know when you learn Torah, the light is on, the spiritual light is on. What is in the world of Sfirot? What is the Sfira of Torah, which is connected to That's the Sfira of Chachma. And the Sfira of Chachma is connected to the Yud, the first Yud in Hashem's name. So that's the Yud which is connected to Chachma, which is connected to Torah, which is connected to Then you have Yud Moisher is Simcha. You have joy. What's Simcha? So we all know it says Moyadim LeSimcha. Hashem gave us the Yom Tovim, the festivals, to be happy. What is Simcha? So we know in the world of Sfirot, Simcha is connected to what? To Bina. Bina, when you know the depth and understanding and the details, that brings about Simcha. In Yud Kei Vav Kei, the Hey, the second letter of Hashem's name, is Bina. And then you have Sasain. What is Sasain? So we know Sasain is connected to the idea of Mila, circumcision. In the Sfiros, which Sfira is it? So it's the Sfira of Yesoid. Chesed word first, that's Chod Yesoid, the last one of the 6 Zeir Amp, the small face of Yesoid, which Yesoid we know is the main Sfira of Zeir Amp, of the small face, and that's connected to the Vav of Yud Kei Vav Kei, of Hashem's name. And Yikar is referring to what? Tefillin. Which Sfira is Tefillin connected to? The Sfira, Yikar is connected to Tefillin, which is connected to the Sfira of Malchus, which that's the last Hey in Hashem's name. And like the Rebbe says, it's brought down in Shari Oira, and that Malchus actually connects you in the Shirish with Atzmus Oirein Seif Baruch, with the infinite light of Hashem. And like it says in Zohar, it says like this, that Tefillin is the image and the seal of Hashem, the highest level of Hashem on high, and it connects us to Malchus. So Tefillin is with the connection of Malchus to the Atzmas inside of himself. So in other words, so through that you have peacefully, we open up to Hashem and we do our avodah of learning Torah and being happy and circumcision and putting on tefillin, we actually draw down the 4 letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei of Hashem in a practical way. And then it comes out in a practical way that we have light and we have joy and we have happiness and we have beauty, we have all the blessings. And the Rebbe finished off, he says, this is what it says, La Yehudim Hoysa Oira. For the Jewish people, there was light. What does it mean, La Yehudim? For the Jewish people, there was light. So the Rebbe brings from the famous Gemara, the Gemara says that whoever denies idolatry is called a Jew. In other words, you want to be a Jew? Deny idolatry. Once you deny idolatry, you're considered a Yehudi. Like Yehudim, who is a Yehudi? Someone that denies idolatry. What is it? How do you deny idolatry? Let's say you're involved, unfortunately, in an environment of idolatry. So you have to go on Mesiras Nefesh. You're willing to give up everything and you're denying idolatry. And that's what the Jewish people did in the times of Purim. They denied idolatry. They went on Mesiras Nefesh. And when they did their avodah, Pischuli, Kechudash al-Macha, they opened up like literally the hole of a needle. We're denying idolatry. What does that mean? They went in Mesiras Nefesh. So then, because they went on Pischuli, they went in Mesiras Nefesh, they were Zoiche to the 4 levels of Oira, Simcha, V'Sasem Yikar, light, joy, happiness, and beauty. And also it says in the Megillah, Ish Yehudi, referring to Mordechai, he was called a Yehudi. in Shushan Abir, what was his name? Mordechai. So we all know the famous question they asked: how do you know Mordechai in the Torah? Where do we find the name Mordechai in the Torah? So it says by the spices, the incense is morderer, and the Targum says what's morderer? Meredachia, which comes from the name of Mordechai. So we see Mordechai is connected to the spices and the incense in the Torah, where it's reference to where the Targum translates morderer as meredachia. And like the author explains in Torah, and he says, so what is a Yehudi? What is a Jew? A Jew is somebody which goes on Mesiras Nefesh. Mesiras Nefesh, giving up idolatry, obviously could be global, but every time you go on Mesiras Nefesh, every time you practice self-sacrifice, that's how you become a Jew. What does that mean? That you're going in self-sacrifice? Because a Jew is Yehudi comes from also Mesiras Nefesh, but also Haidaya. Haidaya means you're willing to accept. Acceptance means you're above intellect. Intellect is understanding. That's not a Jew. A Jew can understand things also, but what makes a Jew is when he's Yehudi, when he accepts. Above intellect. And when someone's willing to accept, that causes the person, inspires the person to go on Mesiras Nefesh. And matter of fact, all the Jews are called Yehudim because they all went on Mesiras Nefesh. And like the Chazal tell us that this was opposite, literally opposite of the way they were before, because the fact was, before they unfortunately bowed down to idolatry. Like it says in detail in the Talmud, it goes into tremendous detail the way they were idolaters. But then when they gave it all up, they went in Mesiras Nefesh. And once they went in Mesiras Nefesh, they were able to draw down from the 4 letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei, on a spiritual level, but also on a practical level. They were able to draw down in their lives, Oira, V'simcha, V'sasa, Yinkar, up until the great light and the great joy, the great happiness, the great celebration, where we have literal physical celebration down in this world, like literally it says in the verse that they had Oira, V'simcha, V'sasa, Yinkar. So obviously this is a very, very, very powerful Chassidic discourse. First of all, it teaches us the importance of the Ketores, and the importance of davening Mincha. But more importantly, it's not only important to read it, but it's also important to experience it. Because we don't want it just to be on an abstract level. We want it to come down physically into this world. And the way it comes down physically in this world is by willing to go on Mesiras Nefesh, doing whatever Hashem wants us to do, to be a real Yehudi, to be accepting. And once we accept, we'll be blessed to have, as the Rebbe says over here, all the 4 letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei. And in a practical way, Oira will have light in our life through learning Torah, Simcha, joy and happiness, Sasa and Vikar, and we'll all be blessed with great and tremendous miracles. So let's hope and pray that before we have the next year, we'll all be in Yerushalayim, Yer HaKodesh, experiencing the real Oira, V'simcha, V'sasa and Vikar. Have a great and blessed week.